Okay, so once again, good day everyone, and welcome back to another topic. So for today's topic is we will be discussing all about resistors in series and parallel and how to also get the equivalent or the total resistance in series, in parallel, or a combination in series and parallel. So let's start with the resistors in series. Okay, so here for the resistors in series, we have this equation. R equivalent is equal to R1 plus R2 plus R3 and so on. So this three dots here is if you have like more than three or any, like let's say for example you have 10 resistors, so up to 10 resistors or R sub 10. But here, we just emphasize um, the equation as the sum. So we have here the equivalent resistance or the total resistance for any number of resistors in series is equal to just the sum of their individual resistances. Okay, so this is what a series or resistors in series look like. So let's say again we have three resistors R1, R2, and R3 from point A to point B. So when we say series is naka-line up silang tulo or naka-line up ang imo ang mga resistors. Or also another example would be let's say from point A, like naka-vertical siya. So this is, then we have another one, then another one, and so on. So let's say we have up to point B. So let's say we have R1, R2, R3, and R4. So this is what a series, resistors in series look like. Okay, so we have two options. It's either naka-horizontal or naka-vertical ang imo ang resistors. So as long as naka-line up ang imo ang mga resistors, then we can call them as resistors in series. So again, to get the equivalent resistance, it is just the sum. So you just need to sum up their individual resistances. Okay, so let's say for example, we have R1 is 10 ohms, R2 is 5 ohms, and then we have R3 is 3 ohms. So to get the equivalent resistance of this one, we have R equivalent is equal to, we have R1 plus R2 plus R3. So R1 is 10 ohms plus we have R2 is 5 ohms plus R3 is 3 ohms. So the equivalent resistance for these three resistors right here, we have 10 plus 5 plus 3, which is equal to 18 ohms. So the equivalent resistance of these resistors or three resistors will be equal to 18 ohms. And again, the unit for the resistor or the resistance, for the unit, we have ohm or ohms. So again, the symbol is omega for the resistance. Okay, so now let's have the resistors in parallel. Okay, so as you can see, it's different from the resistors in series. Kay kung sa series, you just need to sum up all their individual resistances. But here, for the resistors in parallel, for any number of resistors in parallel, the reciprocal of the equivalent resistance, which is 1 over R equivalent. When we say reciprocal, it is 1 over, and then the equivalent resistance or R equivalent is equal to the sum of the reciprocals of their individual resistances. Okay, so that's why we have here 1 over R equivalent is equal to, we have 1 over R sub 1 plus 1 over R2 plus 1 over R3 and so on, depending on how many resistors do you have nga naka-parallel. Okay, so as you can see here in the figure, we have three resistors that are in parallel. So this is what a parallel resistors look like. And also, we can also have it like this one. Let's say we have this one. we can also redraw resistors or have the resistors in parallel like this one. So let's say this is our R1, this is R2, and this is R3. Okay, so now how do we get the equivalent resistance? Kay kaning naa sa equation is the reciprocal paman, reciprocal of the equivalent resistance. Okay, so let's say again the same value. Let's say R1 is 10 ohms, R2 is 5 ohms, and R3 is equal to 3 ohms. Okay, so let's try to calculate the equivalent resistance. So we have 1 over R equivalent is equal to, we have 1 over R1 plus 1 over R2 plus 1 over R3. So we have right here 1 over 10 ohms plus 1 over 5 ohms plus 1 over, we have 3 ohms. Okay, so our 1 over R equivalent, or the 1 over equivalent resistance is equal to, let's try to calculate, it is equal to 19 over 30. Okay, so better if we have it in fraction because it's easier to get the reciprocal sa value if naka-fraction ang imo ang answer sa 1 over R equivalent. Okay, so 1 over R equivalent is equal to 19 over 30 ohms. So this is not yet our final answer because we are asked to get the equivalent resistance or the R equivalent. But kani siya is the reciprocal pa man. So we need to get the reciprocal for 1 over R equivalent so that we can get the value of R equivalent. So the reciprocal of 19 over 30 is 30 over 19. So again, when we say reciprocal, when we get the reciprocal of a fraction, the numerator becomes the denominator and the denominator becomes the numerator. So this is what is happening right here. So our R equivalent now is 30 over 19, which is equal to 1.57894738, or in two decimal places we have 1.58 ohms. Okay, so this is now our final answer for the equivalent resistance. So this is again, once you get the sum of the reciprocals of their individual resistances, now we need to do again, or we need to get again the reciprocal so that we can get the equivalent resistance. Okay, so that is for the resistors in parallel. So again, recap for series, we just need to sum up all of the individual resistances. But for the resistors in parallel, the reciprocal of the equivalent resistance, or 1 over R equivalent, is equal to the sum of the reciprocals of the individual resistances. So if you may recall, the capacitors in series and parallel, actually opposite siya. Kaya kung sa capacitors in series, it is the reciprocal of the equivalent capacitance. But for the capacitance in parallel is, you just need to sum up all of their individual capacitances. So for the resistors, it's the opposite or the other way around. Okay, so let's try. Okay, so this is what it looks like sa combination when it comes to combining both series and parallel. Okay, so what you will do is we need to simplify the circuit. So what do you mean by simplifying the circuit? So mangita kag way nga ma-simplify nimo ang imong circuit. It's either kwaon nimo daan, or if na kay nakita nga naka-parallel or naka-series daan nga duha ka resistor, then you get the equivalent resistance of the two resistors. It's either in series and parallel. And then para dili mo maglibog is you can redraw the circuit with the simplified na circuit. Okay, so let's have this one. So here in this first figure, figure number 1, let's have it as figure number 1. So we have here R1 and then R2 and R3. So notice na si R2 and R3 are in parallel. So what you will do to simplify this circuit is to get first the equivalent resistance of R2 and R3. So we have, let's say, 1 over R, let's say RA. Okay, dili pa man siya equivalent gyud or the total resistance of the circuit. So 1 over RA is equal to 1 over R2 plus 1 over R3. So, let's say for example, our 1 over RA is 3 over 10 ohms. So, si RA is 10 over 3 ohms. So, to simplify the circuit, let's redraw it again. So, let's say point A, this is point A. And then we have R1. So, what will happen now is since gikuha naman nato ang sum of these two resistors in parallel, so it becomes 1. So, it becomes in series together with R1. So, this is R1 and this is RA. So, from point A to point B. So, after this one, na-redraw na nimo or na-simplify na nimo ang circuit by solving first the total of these two resistors na nakaparallel. So, ang next nimo buhaton is, since naka-series naman siya, so you can now get the equivalent resistance. So, to get the equivalent resistance or total resistance, you just need to sum up or add R1 and R sub A. So, let's say for example, R1 is 5 ohms. So, 5 ohms plus our RA is 10 over 3 ohms. So, our equivalent resistance now will be, we have 5 plus 10 over 3 is equal to 25 over 3 ohms, or it is equal to 8.33 ohms. So, that is how you would solve the resistors, combination of resistors in series and parallel. Now, for the second figure, as you can see right here, we have again 3 resistors. Now, notice na wala ni siya naka-series ni silang tulo ha, because we have here point A and point B. So, ang naka-series lang ani is si R2 and R3. Okay, so now, let's say R sub A, we need to get the total of R2 and R3 first, because the sum of this one will be in parallel with R1. So, we have RA is equal to R2 plus R3. And then, to simplify na dayon the circuit, we have, this is your RA. So, this is point A, and then this is our R1. So, our last step is to get the, nakaparallel man ni silang duha, so 1 over R equivalent is equal to 1 over RA plus 1 over R sub 1. And then, get the, when you have now the total of this, the reciprocal of, the sum of the reciprocal of these two resistors na nakaparallel, then you can get the R equivalent, which is again, the reciprocal of kung pila ang value nimo sa 1 over R equivalent. So, that is how you would get the equivalent, or how you would simplify the circuit, or how you would determine to simplify the circuit sa combination in series and parallel. Okay, so let's try some of the examples right here. So we have our first example. Find the equivalent resistance of the network. So this is the network in the figure, and the current in each resistor. Okay, so our first goal is to get the equivalent resistance. Okay, so we have here, notice nga, si 6 ohms and si 3 ohms nga resistor are in parallel. So what we need to do is we need to get first the total of these two, para when we simplify the circuit, it becomes in series with 4 ohms. Okay, so here, we have 1 over RA. Let's have it as RA or whatever you want, kung sa inyo ang gusto nga pag-label. So it's up to you. So we have 1 over 6 ohms plus 1 over 3 ohms. So 1 over R sub A is equal to 1 half. 1 half ohms. So our R sub A is equal to 1 half. The reciprocal of 1 half is 2 over 1, or we have 2 ohms. So this is our RA. Okay. So now, if we want to simplify the circuit, it becomes like this. So we have, say we have our battery here. So this is our 4 ohms. And now, this is now our R sub A, which is equal to 2 ohms. So what will happen? So let's say point A, and then we have here our point B. So, notice nga naka-series na si 4 ohms and si R sub A. So, we can now get the equivalent resistance, which is the sum of these two resistors, which is we have 4 ohms plus RA, or we have 4 ohms plus 2 ohms. So, our equivalent resistance will be 6 ohms. So, this is now our total or our equivalent resistance for this one. Okay, so now how about for the current in each resistor? Okay, so let's have the current for this resistor, si 4 ohms. So, diba, from the Ohm's law, which is V is equal to I times R, to solve for the current, we need to divide both sides with R para ma-cancel out niya siya. So, we have I is equal to V over R. So, we will be using this equation right here. Okay, so to solve for, let's have it right here. So, we have I is equal to V over R. This is our main equation or main formula to solve for the current. So, for 4 ohms, for 4 ohms, we have I is equal to, our V is 18 volts. 18 volts divided by, our R is our equivalent resistance, which is 6 ohms. So, 6 ohms. So, the current for 4 ohms is, we have 18 divided by 6 is equal to 3, and then the unit is in terms of amperes, or capital letter A. So, this is the current passing on the 4 ohm nga resistor. Now, how about for the 6 ohms nga resistor? So, again, same equation or same formula, we have V over R. So, our V is again still 18 volts divided by 6 ohms. Okay. Okay, before that, it's not 18 volts, but since, wait, I'll erase this one first. Take note na for points C and B, di ba nakaparallel silang duha. So, the potential, okay, since from point A to point C, 18 volts naman ang gaagi kay 4 ohms. Okay, but for C and B, point C and B, duha naman ka resistor. So, we need to get first the voltage from point C and B. So, using the Ohm's law, we have I times R. So, the current the potential difference Okay, so the potential difference here, we have I is the current that we will be using is the current passing through. Okay, niagi man siya din he. So, it is 3 amperes. But the resistance na ato ang gamiton is not the equivalent resistance but the kanisya si R sub A, which is the total for this 2. Okay, again nakaparallel man siya. So we have 2 ohms. So we have our voltage from point CB is equal to 3 times 2 is 6 volts. Okay. So now, the current in 6 ohms as well as in 3 ohms will now be, we have I is equal to V over R. So we have 6 volts divided by the R now will be the total or the equivalent resistance, which is 6 ohms. So the current is equal to 1 ampere. So this are for these 2 resistor here. Kaya again, nakaparallel man silang duha. So for 4 ohms, ang niagi sa iya nga current is equal to 3 amperes. But pag abot na dahil diri sa point C to point B, since nakaparallel silang duha, ang ilaang current will be same, which is equal to 1 ampere. So that is how we would solve for the equivalent resistance as well as the current for each resistor. Okay, so let's have another one or second example. Yes. So find the total or equivalent resistance of the network in the figure. Okay, so we have R1, R2, R3, and R4. So we have 4 resistors right here. Okay, so now, atong pangitaon is how we would simplify the circuit or the network. So as you can see here, R3 and R4 are in series. So naka-series siya. So muna itong unahon para ma-simplify na to hinay-hinay ang atong circuit. Okay, so let's have it as RA or R sub A. We have RA is equal to R3 plus R4. So R3 is 6 ohms plus R4 is 4 ohms. So 6 plus 4 is equal to 10 ohms. Okay, so now if we will now simplify the circuit, we have now, say this is the battery. This is our R1. This is our V. And then this is our R2. This is R2. So now our RA is now right here. So this is our RA. So notice na pod na si R2 and RA are in parallel. So this 2 right here is naka-parallel. So our next step is, let's say 1 over R sub B, kay parallel man, is equal to 1 over R sub 2 plus 1 over R sub A. So we have here 1 over 10 ohms plus 1 over 10 ohms. So 1 over R sub B is equal to 1/5. 1 over 5 or 1/5 ohms. So to get the reciprocal to solve for RB, the reciprocal of 1/5 is 5 over 1, or we have 5 ohms. Okay, so now again, if we need to simplify the circuit, again we have our battery, we have our R1, and now this one. This is our RB. So notice na R1 and RB are in series. Okay, so this is our final step na. So we can now say na we can get the equivalent or total resistance. So we have R equivalent is equal to R1 plus R sub B. So R1 is 7 ohms plus RB is 5 ohms. So our equivalent resistance or total resistance, 7 plus 5 is we have 12 ohms. So this is now our equivalent or total resistance of this network or of this circuit right here. Okay, so that is how we would get or how we would solve for the total or equivalent resistance in combination with both series and parallel connection. So again, recap, for series, to get the equivalent resistance, we have R equivalent is equal to the sum of their individual resistances. Bahala, pagpila ka buok na imo ang 2 Rn. Let's say N is equal to how many or pila ang amount sa imong resistors na naka-series. And then for parallel, we have 1 over R equivalent is equal to the sum of, the sum of the reciprocal of their individual resistances. So 1 over R1 plus 1 over R2 plus 1 over R3 and so on until we have 1 over Rn, depending on how many resistors are there na naka-parallel. Okay, so I think that's it for our discussion with regards to resistors or how to get the equivalent resistance in both series and parallel. So, that's it for our discussion for today, and we'll see you again on our next topic. Thank you.